This episode of On Point features an interview with General Stan McChrystal, co-founder of the McChrystal Group. Following his retirement from the U.S. Army after 34 years, he founded the McChrystal Group, which is an advisory team that partners with businesses to improve the performance of their organizations and help build resilient and adaptable teams that can win in today's dynamic environment. In this episode, McChrystal talks about wanting to follow in his father's footsteps to attend West Point and be a military hero. We learn about his initial struggles at West Point and how he went from the bottom of his class to improve his standing on the dean's list. He provides insight about navigating life as a junior officer and then as a general officer in high-stakes situations. McChrystal discusses a Rolling Stone article about his command group and how he handled the fallout and changes to his career that led to starting a new business. He also provides thoughts on mentorship, transitioning from the military to civilian life, and the importance of taking care of yourself. Now, please enjoy this interview between Stan McChrystal and your hosts, Tim Shaw and Lance Dietz.
Welcome to On Point. I'm your host, Tim Shaw, West Point class of 2004.
And I'm Lance Dietz, class of 2008.
And today we are joined by a very special guest, General Stan McChrystal, class of 1976. Stan, how are you?
I'm doing great. I'm from another millennium, I guess, than you guys. That's a little bit frightening. It's really a pleasure to be on. Thanks for having me.
Let's get into our first segment, AAR, for our non-military listeners, After Action Review. In this segment, I'd like to touch on specifically what other veterans can learn from you, your process, and your journey. When and how did joining the military come up on your radar?
Well, let me go back on the AAR idea, because if we can learn from what other people have done, the mistakes they've made, where the landmines are, then maybe we can avoid stepping on them ourselves. So if I can do a little of that today, it'd be great. I grew up in an Army family. My father was a soldier, a West Point grad from 1945. His father was a soldier. My brothers were soldiers. My sister married a soldier. And so from my earliest memory, I wanted to be my dad. He was my hero. If he'd been something else, I would want to be that. And so he was a soldier, so I wanted to be like him. And he had gone to West Point, so I just sort of reflexively thought, well, that's what I should do. In fact, I didn't apply to any other colleges. And West Pointers will enjoy this. I didn't get my acceptance until the last week of May, and I had to report a month later. And that's white knuckle time, because I'm getting up close. I hadn't been accepted anywhere, had no plan. And then at the last minute, I guess they lowered the standards and they let me in.
What was your first few years at West Point like?
Not good. I got to West Point with this idea that I wanted to be my dad. And he was an infantry officer, and he had been in Vietnam, and my brother had been in Vietnam. So that's what I was thinking about. I wasn't thinking about West Point. To me, it was just sort of a gate you go through, like a toll booth on the New Jersey Turnpike. And so I showed up at West Point, not taking it very seriously. I'm 17 years old when I arrived. West Point is 170 years old when I arrived. They took themselves very seriously. And so several friction points arose. The first was I got slugged in Beast Barracks. Almost nobody gets slugged in Beast Barracks. I got slugged along with a fellow new cadet classmate of mine for perceiving to be disrespectful to my squad leader. In fact, they called it disapprobation towards a cadet superior. I didn't know what disapprobation meant. What had happened is he had come and he'd caught us doing something, and so he'd braced us in the wall, and he yelled at us a while, and then he walked away, and we turned at each other and just kind of shrugged our shoulders and laughed, and he had circled around and caught us doing the shrug and laughing. And so boom, I got slugged. And then I didn't take my academics very seriously. I didn't have a strong math background when I went to West Point, unlike some of my classmates. So I got put in one of the top sections of math initially because my SAT was pretty good in math, and I sunk down to the 34th section of math. A lot of people didn't know there was a 34th section of math. And I mean, it was literally, I was down there with very few of us actually graduated that were in that group. But it was really tough because I wasn't real mature in my study habits, so I didn't apply myself very well. We were doing subjects that I wasn't good at, and I had growing pains at putting up with the discipline. And so I got slugged, and the next year and a half, I got slugged 3 more times, which are, for people who aren't West Pointers, those are big punishments. And so in my first year and a half, I became a century plus man. I had 128 hours on the area, 3 months special confinement. Later, that was declared unconstitutional, but I'd already done my 3 months special confinement. And I was right at the bottom of the class. In fact, 1 week I was living in my plebe year, I was living with a guy who was really high in the class. And we used to be able to go to this one room in the barracks and get your grades. There was a big sort of a teletype computer. And you type in your cadet number, and then it would make this noise, and it would batch your grades. And it would say the grade in each class, and then your rank in each class, and then your cumulative rank. And so he went down 1 week, and I had gone the week before, and I was something like 1,260 out of 1,275 in the class. Yeah, I had 15 slots. I was good. And he went and got his grades, and he came back, and I said, okay, what do you got? He says, I'm number 12 in the class. I said, okay. And he says, out of 1,250. And I'm doing the math. I said, wait a minute, I'm 1,260. And so I rushed down the thing, and of course, I was still slightly under the number, but I had a tough time the first 2 years. And then a number of things happened to me. One, I think you get enough scar tissue, you start to get a little bit smarter. I met a girl and got serious about her. And we'd been married for 45 years now. And so for the last 2 years, I had sort of a purpose there. And then I had a new tactical officer come in. And I had a good tactical officer the first 2 years. But I had a new one come in at the very beginning of Cal year. He was doing interviews with all the cadets and just sort of one after another. And he brought me into his office and he goes, nice to meet you. And he says, I think you are a good cadet and you're going to be a great soldier. And I sort of leaned over the desk. I said, you must have somebody else's file here. You better, get the paperwork straight. And he says, no. The things that you are good at, I think, are going to translate well into the Army. And the things that you are sort of ham-headed about, you're not thoughtful, don't matter. They only matter at West Point. And once you get through this will be fine. And, that guy, his name was David Barato, and he became my battalion commander later in Special Forces. And he just sort of changed my own thought of myself, the fact that somebody expressed that kind of confidence. And those other factors all went together. In my last 2 years, I did very well academically, very well in other things, and almost balanced out, those 2 misspent years.
What you shared was really interesting for a few points. One is another guest, former Secretary of the VA, McDonald, talked about if he had only enough time, he would have been first in his class. Because when he was talking about it, he's like, I was almost first in my class, and I just need another semester, and I would have been first. Lance and I tend to think if we had just another semester, we'd have dropped even more. It seems like for you, another semester would have, you would have kept going up and to the right.
Yeah, I would have never caught Bob. Bob and I were lieutenants together. He was a year ahead of me at West Point. We were lieutenants together in the 82nd. I wasn't nobody at the very top was hearing footsteps from me. But the reality is I got up and I was on the dean's list and I was on the superintendent's list. And so my last 2 years, life was pretty sweet compared to the first 2.
The other thing that's interesting is every guest has talked about West Point being as close as it comes in this world to a pure meritocracy. And I have dreams, or might I say nightmares sometimes, about just how meritocratic it is. It's like no one cares if your parents were generals. No one cares where you come from. And it's like everyone just goes and they still have grades outside the doors and you look at it. And I'm curious your thoughts on that.
I think that's true. I think West Point went to an extraordinary effort and still does to be a meritocracy. The only thing I would challenge is the metrics that they use. In my class, the class of 76, amazing collection of talent, there were 3 4-stars. Both were way lower in the class than I was, and one was 12 from the bottom. And so by one metric of the meritocracy, they might have looked at it and said, this guy's not going to be great. But David Rodriguez, is one of the most amazing soldiers we've ever produced. And the other guy was Ray Odierno, who's Chief of Staff of the Army. So when I look at that, you probably might not have, by the strict numbers, have predicted any of us to go anywhere. So I think it's fair, but I'm not sure it always measures exactly what is going to play out in the military.
And I think that's a really interesting insight. And I promise you, before this conversation, I've been thinking about it a lot, that a number of good cadets are great officers and great cadets are mediocre officers. And to your point, it's just different metrics.
Yeah.
And if you're not evolving to what the different metrics are, then you won't catch up. Also really interesting, and this is something Lance and I oftentimes try to have guests reveal, is mentors. Because we think mentors are really critical. I can speak for myself that there's been 2 or 3, I like to call Fox Connors, like Dwight Eisenhower's mentors, that are really instrumental in our careers. And it sounds like David Barato was that for you.
He was. He was one of the first mentors I had, first as a cadet, and then as a young officer after 2 years in the 82nd, I went over to his Special Forces Battalion, and he's remained a friend to this day. So you're really lucky if you get the chance to interact and develop a relationship like those, because one, it helps you grow, but also when you get the chance to become one, it does the same for you in reverse.
Sir, I just have a quick question before we dive in deeper. I'm curious, as you alluded to having a really rough first 2 years, but having a military family, father who was incredibly successful in the military, how did those conversations go? Did they happen? Was it, Stan, what are you doing? Or Stan, don't worry about it. Like, it's going to be fine. Like, I'm just curious, like, how that interaction went with a military family as well that were very familiar with West Point versus, like, for me, I don't come from a military family. So those conversations are quite different if things are going well or poorly at West Point, but I'm curious how it was for you.
Yeah, it was not my father's style. He didn't push me to go to West Point. In fact, he very carefully didn't, because he didn't want to push me into something he thought might not be right. So I kind of pushed myself. When I got there, he didn't push me at all either. I think he was a little bit amused at the challenges I was having, because I don't think he thought that they were as serious as some people at West Point did. And also, to be honest, in those couple of years, my first 2 years, actually my first 3 years at the academy, my father was going through a difficult period in his life. My mother had passed away, and he was going through some tough years. And so our relationship evolved a bit. And so I was supporting him as well as he supporting me. So it was a very healthy thing over time. But we all go through different points in our lives when challenges come up, and that was one for him, and sort of by reflection, one for me and my siblings as well.
One thing you identified was around how you can be met with obstacles at one point and then success later. And a lot of people who listen to this podcast are transitioning folks who are transitioning from the military to the civilian sector. And Lance and I talk with a lot of transitioning folks. And one of the things that I often make sure I tell them is it's going to be okay. Meaning, like, this transition is really difficult, but you're going to have a great journey and probably tremendous success. It feels like if and when you go back to West Point, you probably tell cadets, regardless of where they are, that they're going to do fantastic. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, I would absolutely say that, because you talk about the meritocracy at West Point, you get very focused on certain things. And I went up and spoke to cadets, 7 or 8 years ago, and I told them, I never learned calculus. I just didn't understand it. But interestingly, in my 34 years as an officer, I never once was in a position where if I could only integrate an equation, we were going to be okay. And, I think that the professors in the audience didn't appreciate that, but that was the truth. There are things that do get both tested and developed in an experience like West Point. Many of those are interpersonal skills, their personal commitment, their inner strength. They are more important than the academic subjects. Now, those are still important. I mean, you've got to, have basic understanding, be intelligent, and be curious. But there are core things that can come through in people that help them through tough times. If you think back, if someone transitioning from the military goes into a civilian company and there's suddenly sort of culture shock. Well, if they go back to reception day, their first day as a cadet, there probably was a bit of culture shock that day too. And when you start to understand that all days like that or periods like that have a beginning, and pretty quick, they get better and better and better. And so I would tell people going through something difficult, the first day is typically the worst. And every day after that is a little bit better. And if you go in with that mindset, no matter what kind of transition you'll make, you'll typically come out pretty well.
Could you share a bit about your experience in the military as a junior officer?
I went to IOBC in the summer of 76 and then to Ranger School. So I got to my first unit, the 82nd, in the late winter of 1977. And I had grown up with these ideas of the 82nd Airborne Division from World War II D-Day and this elevated. And the 1970s 82nd was not that. In fact, it was struggling. I went to a battalion, first to the 504. We had tremendous talent there. Bob McDonald was a year ahead of me as a lieutenant. We had tremendous other talent, but it wasn't a very good battalion. If I compare it to battalions I was in 10 or 15 years later, we couldn't have held our own for 30 seconds. It wasn't that the quality of soldiers were bad people. It was just a combination of factors. The leadership had gotten weak. The Army was going through a bit of identity crisis. We didn't train very effectively. And so a combination of things were pretty disappointing to me. On the one hand, when you're in the field with young paratroopers, their hearts as big as all outdoors, and you love them. On the other hand, I had a battalion commander who wasn't a very good leader. And he would always talk one thing. And then one morning, when he was struggling to make re-enlistment quotas, that each battalion had targets they had to make, we had barred a young paratrooper to re-enlistment, and he was an incredible dirtbag. I mean, he should not just have been barred, he should have been probably in jail. But we had barred him from re-enlistment. In those days, that wasn't common. But the battalion commander on the last day of the quarter called down to the company, or had somebody call down to the company, got the soldier, brought him up to battalion headquarters, and let him re-enlist to make quota. And after all the talk about standards, to see that happen was deflating. And it wasn't all like that. I mean, there were great leaders there too, but there were enough things like that that I think taught a lot of us that when we got into positions of greater responsibility, we weren't going to let that be the case. And the idea of standards and values became more and more important to me because you've seen the cost of not having them.
So I'm really curious too, just kind of as a junior officer, how your relationship with senior NCOs manifested and how sort of some of the training and guidance and mentorship at West Point contributed to a positive experience or one that was challenging.
Well, my experience was good, but I made mistakes that probably I'm probably not the only person that ever made them. I got to a platoon, and I had not an older guy, but compared to me, he was older, platoon sergeant. And he was kind of a more conservative sort of a guy. And I had these squad leaders who didn't really respect him because he was old school and they really weren't very good at all. And then there was a section sergeant between them. It was a mortar platoon. And the section sergeant was a young, Ranger qualified, kind of charismatic guy, good soldier. But I came in and it was a sort of a power struggle inside the platoon. And because demographically and all, I was actually closer in age to the squad leaders and that young section sergeant, I didn't support the platoon sergeant like I should have. Now, he had some shortcomings, but the reality is what I did was I wanted to be popular. I wanted to be popular with, not just the troops, but I wanted to be powerful. I didn't want to compete with the platoon sergeant. And so I sort of unconsciously undercut him. If you'd asked me at the time, I wouldn't have said I was doing that. But in retrospect, and I look at it, I didn't support him like I should have. Now, the section sergeant became the platoon sergeant. I became more mature. He became a great platoon sergeant. And you kind of go on, but you step back and you go, I made a mistake. In that instance, I was wrong. And you can't make up for it. You can't fix it. All you can do is say, all right, I screwed that up. I'm not going to make that mistake as a leader again in the future.
There's a number of our listeners who are either current cadets or current officers. And both Lance and I are not on active duty anymore. But when we were on active duty, the thing that we really cared about was progressing through the ranks. And I think it's somewhat taboo, to very taboo actually, in the ranks to say, how do I progress and grow my career and become potentially a general officer? And so I guess for those listeners who wouldn't ask that question, I'll ask that question. I know context is really critical here in the sense that the military has changed greatly since when you progressed. But what do you think some table stakes for officers who want to become a general officer? What do they need to do, and how should they think about their careers?
Yeah, no, it's fair. Most of us didn't go in our career. I never thought about being a general officer. My father was a general officer, but I didn't think about that. I thought about maybe I could be a company commander. And then when I became a company commander, I looked up and I said, I could be a battalion operations officer. I watched that guy, I could do that, and then kind of stair step. But I will tell you the things that I think, in retrospect, are the most important. The first is, as quick as you can figure it out, and it's hard on any given day, figure out who you are and what your values are. Figure out what you will do and what you won't do. And that's really important, because if you don't get your values set, because everybody ought to have a set of what's right, what's wrong, and that sort of thing. And hopefully they're good values, but you got to figure out what yours are. If you're malleable, and we've all known people who are, you're going to blow like a reed in the wind. The second is try to be as competent as you can in your business. You don't have to be a fanatic without a life, but learn your trade, because people's lives depend upon it. The next is be a good follower. I don't think you can be a good leader without being a good follower. And that also means, as you interact with your peers, your relationships to them. There are a lot of people that we've all seen, some who immediately think that if I ingratiate myself to more senior officers, that's going to be the way I'm going to progress. And in a very narrow sense, maybe they'll get you the next job. But I will tell you, the people who decide whether you are successful ultimately in the Army are your peers. Because as you go up and the pyramid gets a bit narrower, decisions are made your reputation, what people say about you, whether people trust you, that sort of thing. And it goes all the way into promotion boards. And so I would say that think about being respected, being the kind of person people want on their flank, being the kind of person they want their son or daughter or brother or sister to work for. You be that person, and most of the rest of it just sort of takes care of itself. The last thing I'll say is, the few people I knew who tried to map out their career, said, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, it didn't work out very well. Even if they got to do all those things, when they stepped back, those things weren't what they thought they'd be. The people I know that enjoyed their career most, they kind of generally followed the route, but they also were opportunistic. If a good job where I could go work for a really good leader, or if I just feel that I ought to do this, do it. Because your heart and gut will tell you a lot more than some page in an officer professional development manual that says you got to do X, X, and X. And at the end of the day, I'd remind everybody, you may spend 20 years in the Army, 30 years, 40 years, whatever rank you end up. Where you end up is kind of irrelevant. It's the quality of that journey. Because I'm retired. What I live with now are the memories and the joys and the friendships and the relationships. And I don't think much about, the last part of where I ended up.
Two, maybe three quick notes riffing off what you said. First is be competent. General McCaffrey, he said you have to be an expert. A leader should be an expert. The second thing is it feels a lot like your guidance applies not just to the military, but outside the military, holistically. And then the other thing that I felt you pretty much said is enjoy the process.
I would add a point to what General McCaffrey said, because while he's right, I would make sure, and don't be the expert. Because, as soon as you start thinking you're the expert, there's a danger you stop listening to all the people around you. And there's nothing that makes the people around you better than when you say, I don't know, tell me, help me out here. And you leverage all the people.
Sir, I'd love to transition a little bit. I mean, it's fantastic to hear about like your time as a junior officer, but it would also be great to hear more about your time as a commanding and general officer, especially during a significant time of war for our country. And maybe I'll just start broad, but if you could just quickly give us an overview of some of the things that you did kind of in the early 2000s until you retired from the military and some of the key positions that you held just for our guests. And then we can dive into a few of those.
Sure. I was promoted to general officer in January of 2001. I'd been selected about almost 2 years before, but lists were going slow. So I was the assistant division commander for operations in the 82nd for that year. And in the midway through it, I actually pinned on 1 star. I spent about the last 10 years of my career as a general officer. Now, life as a general officer is different from what I thought it would be, because I never saw my father in the field or anything. I didn't know what he did as a general. But my experience was on the bad side, generals have to deal with a fair amount of politics, not politics in the big sense, but politics, just interpersonal stuff. You have to make a lot of tough decisions, and you have to do certain things that are almost ceremonial that some people love and I wasn't as excited about. But on the other hand, you have the ability and the experience now and the power to make things happen. You can scratch some itches, and the more senior you get, the easier it is to do that. And so if you use that authority and leverage people have given you, you can start to make a real difference. And you can feel that, and that's very rewarding. I found it very interesting that suddenly I was at war as a general officer. And I was at war. First, I was in the 82nd, and then I went to be the Corps Chief of Staff at 18th Airborne Corps. And that's when we deployed to Afghanistan. And I was that when the Corps became the command and control headquarters for that. And that was interesting because you could orchestrate a lot of things. I came back and was put as the Vice Director for Operations on the Joint Staff in the Pentagon. That was my first time in the Pentagon in my whole career. I didn't know where the restrooms were. I didn't know how anything worked. And I think the method to their madness was John Abizaid was one of my mentors at that point. He was the director of the Joint Staff. And so he pulled me into the Pentagon, threw me into this pretty high pressure job. And, hey, figure it out. And I had that year to do it. I got a really interesting perspective that year because I got there in the late summer of 2002. And so the ramp up, preparation, and conduct of the invasion of Iraq occurred. And then I left 14 months to the day later. So I watched the invasion from afar, but did all the things that the Pentagon does to support. On the one hand, it was fascinating because you got to see how these decisions were being made. On the other hand, we got some things wrong. We, the military, we, the US government, we just made some big mistakes. And some of them were driven by the fact we let our processes. We didn't get enough conversation about big issues that later proved very problematic as Iraq became hard. So I came out of that and I went into Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. And I'd been in that command as a ranger, but also as a staff officer earlier in my career. So I was familiar with it. But it was a very different experience, one, to be in charge of it, and two, I stayed almost 5 years in command of it. And we were deployed in the fight the whole time. So I got the opportunity to lead a really amazing group of people in a very important fight across the Mideast. The hottest part of the fight was clearly Iraq. And so I spent most of my time there, but I stayed deployed almost the entire 5 years. And it was, on the one hand, you say, well, war's terrible. On the other hand, it was the most fulfilling, probably, period of my life. I'm separated from my wife, which I hated. But on the other hand, I'm doing what I was trained to do around people who are all doing it. And we're doing, things that I was learning from and I felt were important. And I got to watch general officers interact with each other in wartime. I'd always seen movies about it and that sort of thing. And it was really interesting because these were the same people you'd grown up with. So it wasn't like suddenly new people show up. It's old Bill and Frank and Susan. I knew you when you were a lieutenant. You were a knucklehead then. And they're thinking the same thing. But you learn that the sinew and the trust between those leaders is just critical. It's coin of the realm. One of my other mentors, an officer named John Vines, was commanding 18th Airborne Corps, and so that became multinational corps Iraq, the most important combat command in the Army at that point. And he basically said, Stan, whatever you need, you've got. You just ask my Corps and we do it. And then later he jokes, he says, I'm the only person who can bounce a blank check. But the reality is those relationships become sacred, and you start to learn about all the things you did when you were younger to build relationships, to build your reputation, to be trustworthy, and how important they become when you're in these meetings where you're almost having an out-of-body experience where you said, wait a minute, I'm one of 3 or 4 senior leaders making strategic decisions, and I never thought I'd be here. I always thought this, I'd read about it in books. And then you suddenly realize you're not only there, you got to live up to it. And so that goes back to my earlier part about get your values right, build those relationships, get competent so that when you're in that position, you are prepared for it.
Sir, I want to go back to the theme of mentors again, just because you've highlighted, and if I was to use these names, people would say name dropped, but you have a relationship with these gentlemen, Barato, Abizaid, Vine. As someone who's a class of 04, I'm very familiar with these names and very seminal leaders in U.S. Army. And so I'm curious, and this is something that a lot of junior officers and transitioning folks really care about. How do you thoughtfully build mentors? And it's a very complicated question. And so I know it kind of comes off as very transactional, but I think a lot of people want to know this.
Yeah, I'll start from the junior person's standpoint. Someone starts to do things that are mentor-like, and you start to build a relationship. There are several things you have to do. I think the junior person has got to show that they are willing and interested in having that relationship. You can't be too pushy. You can't say, give me your time, this, but the conversations, so you got to listen. There is also a time when if your mentor says, I think you shouldn't do this, I think you should do this, you got to make a decision there, because General Vines, I was going to go to one job and he got a hold of me and he says, no, I want you to go to this job next. And I said, Roger. And of course it was the great move because he was concerned about me. Later, John Abizaid, when I was a colonel and I was told I was going up to compete to go to the Council on Foreign Relations for a year-long fellowship. And I didn't want any part of that. I'd done a fellowship at Harvard for a year. I'd commanded the Ranger Regiment, and I was told I could go to 18th Airborne Corps, be the G3, and boom. And Abizaid called me and he said, hey, go to New York. I said, why? He says, you've spent your whole life doing operational stuff in the Army. Go learn other stuff. Go meet other kinds of people, meet business people, meet political people. Air your mind out a little bit. And, I could have said, nah, you're wrong. And I didn't do it just because he told me, but I did pay attention. And then there's that issue and I've had this a couple of times, I've not done it to anybody, but I've had a couple of junior people below me come and ask me for help. And they say, will you go see if you can get Commander X to give me a job in his unit? And I go, that's what you want to do? And they go, yes, I do. So I go and I interact with that person. I say, this officer's great. I really wish you'd hire her or him and, do that, advocate for them. And in a couple cases, the officer then got offered a job, but in the interim, they'd gotten a better offer. And they said, well, I decided not to take that job. And I said, I'm not mad at you. Just don't ever ask me for anything again. Because I went out, Now, if the officer had gotten assigned to something that was not their choice, hey, that's fine. But he had asked somebody. And so if you ask someone to make a commitment for you, you're really kind of committed. You've got to follow through.
Sir, I feel like we could go on for a couple more hours just on your military experience. I would like to transition to some of the stuff you've been doing for the past decade or so with the McChrystal Group. But one thing, if you don't mind me asking, I would love to hear more about your decision to retire from the military surrounding, the Rolling Stone article and so on. And you alluded to values. I mean, had to be an incredible decision to weigh. But if you could share a bit just kind of on how you approach that situation and how you wrestled with it, I think would be really, really interesting.
Yeah, it wasn't as hard a decision as people might perceive, but it was a painful one. Rolling Stone had a freelance reporter embedded with us on and off for just limited periods, not a lot. And he wrote this article that I thought was very unfair, that portrayed myself and my command group as not professional and not respecting, in particular, the vice president and whatnot. Again, I didn't think it was accurate, but that didn't matter. I'm in command, and this article ends up on my commander-in-chief's desk, and it's a political sort of bombshell for him. And so as soon as I saw the article, I said, okay, this ends it. So I was asked to fly back that day from Afghanistan for a meeting with the White House. I prepared my resignation, and I went to meet with the president. He was a complete gentleman. He said, what happened? I said, actually, I don't know. I haven't been able to investigate this, but here's the deal. I accept responsibility. And I said, I've got my resignation here. If you want me to go back in command, I will. If you want to accept my resignation, I'm going to have no hard feelings about it. And he said, I'm going to accept it. And he was good, and I bear him no ill will for that decision. I wish he made a different one, but that's okay. Well, in an instant, my career was over. Remember, I'd been born in an Army hospital, grown up in an Army family, going to West Point at 17, been in the Army as an officer for 34 plus years. And suddenly it is over in that instant. It's not even just over. It's over on the front page of the newspapers and on TV every 2 minutes for however long a news cycle lasts, 2 or 3 days. And it's embarrassing, and it's hurtful to my father, who was an 86-year-old retired guy at that point. My son is in college. And my wife, of course, I can hardly describe what that kind of thing does. The key thing about that is clearly the lowest point in my life, because I never thought I'd be accused of the kinds of things that article insinuated. I didn't think that was me. In fact, I know it wasn't me. But I had a choice to make. And a lot of people are going to get a version of this choice in their lives. The choice is, I am going to marinate in my bitterness, and I'm going to be an aggrieved old officer, and I'm going to spend the rest of my career saying I got screwed. And a certain number of people will listen to you. They'll take you to lunch just to hear that story if they don't like political leadership. But it takes as much energy to be bitter and focus on that as it does to move forward. And I don't think you can do both at the same time. And so with the help of my wife, who's absolutely forward-looking every day of her life, from the moment I got back to her, and I remember I'd been gone, and I'd suddenly fly back and resign, and suddenly I'm in the house saying the career's over. And she just looked at me and she says, good. We've always been happy and we'll always be happy. And from then on, what we haven't done at all is try to relitigate that. We've just said, okay, this is the new reality, and what we're going to do is try to conduct myself in a way that anyone who believed in me beforehand is going to say, yeah, I'm watching him now. I was right to believe in him. And anybody who never met me wasn't going to define me by a single article in Rolling Stone. Instead, they were going to look at me and they go, wow, that doesn't seem like what I read. And so here I am, 55 years old the day that happens. Zero plan for retirement. No, some people have a clever roadmap. I didn't. And so what do? Well, first you get your mind right. That's key. And my wife was critical to that and still is. And then a friend of mine said, you want to start a business? And I said, yeah, why not? How hard can starting a business be? Little did I know. We didn't have any money. We didn't have a plan. All we thought was we had learned some things in the military that might translate into business. Not military lessons, but things about a new complex environment in the world. And so on the basis of that hypothesis, we started a business which is now 12 years old and almost 100 people. And it's been the most amazing adventure to be a part of, because it's so different from what I did, but yet the human side of it is so similar. It's still committed people trying to do great stuff. And I think if military people watch my example, if at 55 I can start a business and it can work and it can be just a great experience, people much more talented than me that can do a lot more.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great segue into our next segment, the sit rep or the situational report, where we kind of dive into what guests are doing now. You just alluded to it with the McChrystal Group. And what I find interesting too is you quickly had the opportunity to begin serving on public company boards, be it JetBlue and Navistar. And so would love to maybe hear a little bit more about, in general, what you're doing now with the McChrystal Group. And then maybe we can dive into some of those lessons and experience as well.
Sure. And everybody's situation's unique. I came out at 55 with no experience at all. But on the other hand, my name was well known. So I did get the opportunity to sit on a couple of corporate boards right away, JetBlue Airlines, Navistar. And then over time, I've sat 12 or 14 of them. And what it is it's a chance to learn. It's a chance to go into things you haven't done before. I was on Deutsche Bank USA's board for 2 years. Big bank, what do I know? But when you peel it back, there's all kinds of details, whether it's an airline or a bank or an AI company. There are specific things I didn't bring, expertise and whatnot. But what I did bring was pretty common. There's a leadership factor, there's a people factor, there's a common sense factor. And everybody coming out of the military has that. Now, younger graduates or younger people coming out of the military of any rank, they've also got the opportunity to go build a little more expertise than I did. They could go to business school or they could go. I didn't really perceive that I had time to do that. But they can do that, build up that expertise, which adds on to experience they've already got and takes them out. The big thing I think I've learned is that the basics matter. Go back to Vince Lombardi and the Green Bay Packers and the power sweep. It wasn't a brilliant play, but what it was, if it was executed with extraordinary discipline, then it was pretty hard to stop. And I think that if an organization now gets their values right, they understand what they are, who they're trying to be. We call it common purpose. If they really can get that identity straight and people can feel connected to it, if they can build trust inside that organization between each other, and that's harder in big companies, but it's still important. If they can share information in a way that stops the siloing and people, I got a secret. Those are basics. But if you get those basics right, almost anything you try to do, whether it's open a bagel shop or a cryptocurrency exchange or anything else, those basics are the foundation upon which it all works. When I see companies fail now or struggle, it's almost never for lack of expertise in knowing what they have to do. It's usually not for lack of an available market being for them. It's in those basics. It's in the communication. It's in how they treat people. It's in basic processes.
Real quick on the basics. I remember vaguely as a cadet, again, I'm dating myself to class of 2004, but back in 2001, 2002, when we had officers come in and do OPDs, they would talk about, and I think I'm getting this wrong, but I hope not, McChrystal's Big Four. And it was apparently you back in the early 2000s, there's Big Four, these are the basics, we have to do these things. And it almost feels like what you've just shared is the civilian version of the Big Four.
Yeah, when I commanded 2nd Ranger Battalion and we'd focused on basics, but it had just, made me more a believer. I went to take the Ranger Regiment a year later, and my command sergeant major, the regimental sergeant major, Mike Hall, and I had known each other before, but we found we were absolutely simpatico. And I said, what we've got to do is be really good at the basics. And he said, that's right. And we literally sat down and said, what do we got to be good at? And it was marksmanship. It was physical ability. Road marching was one metric of that. Small unit drills and medical, the ability to save your buddy. And we talked about the Big Four, and the way we used them was to keep people focused. Clearly, they were going to train on some other things also. But every time they heard from me, I was going, okay, where are we on the Big Four? Boom, boom. I think people got so sick, they saw me coming and they started to get nausea. But after a while, you start to have young Ranger privates saying, you know, sir, we focus here on the big four. Let me tell you about them, not knowing that, you know, I've been involved in them. And I think leaders sometimes don't understand how important it is to get a very clear narrative and just hammer it. Boom. Don't give up on it. Say it until, you always say that the rule of three is you got to say something 3 times before people believe it. I think it's 300. And of course, with turnover in units, that's even more true. So I still believe now that if you give people mooring points of things like the big four, it's really powerful.
So just tapping like into that a little bit, one of the 4 things that I read on the website about kind of an approach that you have with teams, one being empowerment. And it reminds me a little bit of just, you know, almost a train the trainer sort of mentality. I'm curious now, like in the civilian world, like how you end up teaching this ability for a leader in a particular organization to empower the rest of the team below them, next to them, and so on, because it does, in my opinion, like come a lot from experience and like having been empowered and also being able to do this. Just curious how you all teach that a little bit.
Yeah, and it's really important, Lance, because it doesn't come naturally. If you're in charge and responsible for the outcome of something, most of us say, well, if you want something done well, I got to do it myself. So you go down, or you at least over supervise it, or you give them such detailed guidance on how to do it that all they're doing is, you know, assembling as you told them. So the first thing you got to change is you. You got to start and say, I am willing to accept a certain amount of risk. Now, in some things, you can be more specific on the quality that it has to be. And on other things, you can say, well, we just got to get this done. It doesn't have to be perfect, because these things do have to be perfect. Then you've got to get your middle leaders in your organization, because you say to your subordinate leaders, I want you to empower your subordinates. But the first time there's a failure, if you turn and bite the head off your subordinate leader, they go, wait a minute. In self-defense, I am going to micromanage because I don't want to get my head bitten off. Now, you can still hold them responsible for developing and the outputs, but you've got to, this is where art is different than just straight science and leadership. You've got to understand that there is a certain range of failure that's going to occur when you decentralize things, when you empower people. Now, cumulatively, you're going to get a much better performance because you can get so much more good happening when people take initiative and they do things, and you are going to have a certain percentage of failure. But as I remind people, when Ted Williams had his Hall of Fame year in 1941, he failed 60% of the time. And so if you've got to get the culture of the organization willing to understand that there is far more positive by accepting that certain amount of risk as people use their initiative and judgment than there is downside. But, you know, again, that's hard even all the way up the chain, because sometimes you're in an organization, the people above you are in a zero defect mindset. And so there's a certain amount of risk for leaders. And I tell people, when you take a command or you take a key job, you have to enter it like it's your last. If you go in there trying to be defensive and not making mistakes because you don't want anything that's going to ding you for the next one, you're not going to be as good as you can be. Now, I want you to, you know, I think people need to be focused and work hard and don't be stupid, but there's a certain amount of risk that comes with responsibility, and live with it.
I think it'd be, just in the sake of time, because we can talk a lot more about McChrystal Group, would like to dive into our third segment, which is the SOP, or Standard Operating Procedure. In this segment, we talk about personal routines, habits, and words to live by that have been instrumental to your success. We know, and we talked about this before recording, about your breakfast and lunch routines. But for those who don't know, could you share some of your daily habits and how you think that helps you?
Yeah. Let me start with, I think, the most important ones. The first is whether you're honest with yourself. You know, you got to be able to get up in the morning and go to bed at night, look in the mirror, and judge how you are going to do that day and how you did that day. And invariably, at the end of the day, I'll have things I didn't do well. I interacted with somebody wrong. I was a jerk, you know, any number of things. And you've got to be able to tell yourself that was not good enough. Otherwise, it does become the new standard. You start to live it. The second one is, how do you treat people? How do you interact with people? And this is a habit as well. The most impressive leaders I've ever known, they literally treat everyone with a level of respect that they deserve. And people, in fact, crave it and respond well with it. They are unfailingly courteous to people at the lowest level of an organization or to the most menial job. And so that's another discipline thing, because again, it doesn't come naturally. Self-discipline in terms of what you say is key. You know, it's easy just to sit there and run your mouth and get emotional in every meeting and whatnot. And when you get very senior, nobody will stop you because there's no bumpers there to do it. And so you see some people who you don't know, and then they get senior and they become total jerks. So the self-discipline of what you say and how you act is key. And that takes an awful lot, because you can be tested, particularly as you get very senior. And then the last is to be honest. You know, if somebody asks you what you think, you know, to the degree, you can't just be honest. It doesn't mean you have to be brutal. You don't have to walk around telling people, hey, I think you're stupid or whatever. But when you're talking about important things, force yourself to be absolutely honest. And there are a lot of pressures not to be. You see people in society all the time. So those are the core. Then there's the other things you do. I got a lot of bad habits. I'm not going to enumerate them here, but I got a few good ones. And one of them is that I work out every day. And I work out hard every day because it's core to me thinking about myself, my own self-image. I don't want to get fat, but I also believe that it's just really important to force yourself to do something. Even in a lot of mornings, I have no interest in working out. But what I've learned is later in the day, I will feel so badly about it that I just want to avoid that. And I've learned it's better just to work out no matter what. So I do. The second is I eat one meal a day. Now, I'm not telling other people to do that, but I ate one meal a day because when I was a lieutenant, I thought I was getting fat. And I didn't have the self-discipline to eat little meals. So what I did was I just said, I'm going to eat one meal a day, dinner, and I'm going to eat whatever I want. So I'm going to work out, and then I'm going to sort of, you know, deprive myself during the day so I can reward myself at night. That has worked for me. Again, it doesn't work for everybody, but in 40 years of doing it, it's a good rhythm for me, and it makes me feel healthier and better. You know, not long ago, I came back in vogue. For a long time, people told me I was stupid, it was going to kill me, and then that intermittent fasting came, and people said I was ahead of my time, and that'll change again, and I'll be, you know, but I don't care. And then when I was in Iraq and in the war, I slept about 4 hours a night, but I'm not recommending that. I did that because that was the cycle I had to do my job. Nowadays, I sleep a lot more. I sleep as much as I can, but I read every day too. You know, I sit down and I actually read, and I read books, and that's a discipline in itself. It forces you not to be on social media doing something, whatever. I sit down. Right now, I'm reading Carl Sandburg's 6 volumes on Abraham Lincoln, and I'm proud of myself. I'm in the 4th volume, and each one's about 400 pages. And I'm not saying people have to read that, but something where you just say, I have got to keep educating myself. Whatever the things are, decide what they are and then stick to them. And when they become habits, they become really good, strong habits.
On this topic, I feel like you could probably do a masterclass course on productivity, given what you squeeze into a day in terms of workout. And I'm not saying this to be obsequious. I think I study a lot of people who get a lot of stuff done. And what you pack into a day is really remarkable. And my question is, I have this debate, and some more context is, I think the Army and the military is fantastic in one regard, especially. You get paid to work out. I tell people, like, it's amazing. Like, only athletes and people in the military get paid to work out. It's amazing. And the one thing, though, I think a lot of people struggle that are, I think generally is like the morning time is the most like productive time. We know that. And like working out feels very selfish. So like, how do you square the two?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I work out in the morning, and I tell people I do it because that's the one time you're typically not, people can't take it away. Now, they can start things earlier, and I just back up my workout. And if I got to get up at 2:30 and work out at 3, I'll do that. I don't like doing that, but I will do that. But for most of us, you control that morning more than any other time, because if you say later in the day, how many times are there pop-up meetings or requirements and you feel guilty if you walk out? When I got to the Pentagon, I mentioned in 2002, I come in there and I've got this habit of working out, and they say, you got to work out every day. Don't do a thing. And then I had to be at my desk in my uniform about 5:15. And then during the day, getting to the gym there, the POAC, every time you left, people kind of looked at you. So there was a narrative that says we want you to work out, and there was this process and cultural pull really that made it hard. I tried to stick to it as best I can, but that's where I think sometimes an organization's rhythm gets off. An organization says, we want you to work out. I think they've got to make it possible. They've got to make it good enough. It's just like we say, we want talented females in the workforce. We want all females in the workforce. We want talented ones. We got to do things like childcare and whatnot. We got to make it possible. If you make it so darn hard to do something and then wonder why they don't do something, shame on us.
By observation through your career and what you've shared and our other guests, it feels like advantages compound. And when you talked about your habits, you talked about, are you honest with yourself? How do you treat people? Family courteous, discipline, self-discipline, honest to others. And it seems like a lot of this foundation is hopefully baked into at West Point over the Army. And then it manifests itself into just productivity externally in how you live your life.
I never thought of it that way, Tim, but I think you're exactly right. I think if you do things that keep you in good health, that keep you sharp, that keep you, ready to do other things, suddenly when opportunities arrive, you are more ready than you'd otherwise be. If you treat people well, if you develop relationships, the day I retired from the military, and we've talked about the circumstances, I didn't want to have a ceremony because I just didn't feel good. But I had a guy convince me I needed to do it. And I had this group of people to show up to the ceremony, which we conducted in the evening, that was extraordinary. And it was like a safety net of people who cared about me there to catch my wife and I. And so all that you invest in relationships pay back in spades. And so when you talk about compounding advantage, I think that's true in almost every segment of your life.
So let's move on to the last segment, which we call giving back. And I think you just alluded to a very great piece of advice there in terms of relationships. But for a lot of listeners out there that are kind of younger in their career or earlier in their career, is there any particular advice that you would give either to those leaving the military, staying in the military to pursue a career there, but just in general, kind of parting thoughts on advice for some listeners?
Yeah, it's prioritization. And that is, during my military career, my wife and I had one son, and he lives next door to us now, and I'm incredibly close to him. But there was a lot of time I wasn't there, and it would be fine if I was off at war, but we were at peace. And there were times when I could have been there, that I was at work doing things that were of marginal additional value, just because I had that habit. And so it's the prioritization. So if you want a good marriage, you better work at it. If you want a good relationship with your kids, you better work at it. If you want to be financially sound, you got to work at that. You got to be responsible. So all of those things that you do, you can just literally sit down and say, if I want to be able to do a lot of push-ups, I got to do a lot of push-ups. If I want to have these other things in my life, I got to do the things that build that up. And the idea of giving to others is key. People ask me what I regret in life, the things I did. There's very little I did that I regret. There's a bunch of things I didn't do I regret. And most of them are around family or things like that. I didn't make it to a ceremony or a retirement or a change of command or a wedding or something because I thought I had something more important. And in the moment I did. And in the grand scheme of things, I don't think I was right.
Sir, this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you for taking so much time out of such a busy schedule to spend with Tim and myself. And for listeners, last thing before I let you go, you alluded to sports a few times as great lessons for leadership. And I think there's a great tie-in with the military and with business in general. And this is going to air after the Super Bowl, but I'm curious if you are going to watch the Super Bowl, and if so, if you have a prediction for the Bengals or the Rams this upcoming weekend?
Yeah, it's funny. I watched the playoff games, and of course, the playoffs this year have been just amazing. And neither of these teams, I think, they don't have the biggest name quarterbacks. They don't have quite the storied recent background to others. And so I think this one is going to be an awful lot about, and interestingly enough, because both of them had tough, roots through the playoffs, I'm not sure where it goes. I mean, it could go either way. I don't lean towards Cincinnati or the Rams, but I just think that it's going to teach us all, you're going to win between your ears. That's the side that's going to win. It's not going to be more talent. It's going to be an emotional thing that I think makes the difference.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, sir, and appreciate your time. And looking forward to having you back on the podcast in the future.
I'd be honored. Thanks, Lance. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you for listening to On Point. Please take a moment to rate and review the show wherever you're listening. It really helps us out. We'll see you in the next episode.